Welcome to the January Agriculture and Forestry Action Team call. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Jake Brenner is a professor of geography in the Department of the Environment and faculty manager of the Ithaca College Natural Lands. He is researching the carbon sequestered in the 560 acres of natural lands, primarily forest, that is part of Ithaca College. His research is collaborative and students play a key role. I'm hoping that we get some members from the Higher Education Action Team on this call, but if not, I'll just post the recording to their forum. So with that, take it away, Jake.
All right, thank you, Nancy. And hello and welcome, everybody. I'm honored to join you and excited to share a little bit about this cool project that we have going on here. Since we are recording, are we good with audio? Nancy, everything's cool? All right, here we go. As Nancy said, my name is Jake, and I, since 2012, have been privileged to serve as faculty manager of Ithaca College Natural Lands. I see my title slide kind of makes it look like I'm working for Citizens Climate Lobby, and while I should be, this is important work. I am not yet, but I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share with you and reflect on myself a little bit how the work that all of us do to mitigate climate change also dovetails with the work that we do in other domains. And for my part, that means managing Ithaca College's forested lands, and it also means teaching. And so much of what I talk about today is going to center on teaching and learning. Okay. Ithaca College Natural Lands is a protected area system which was founded in 2004, consists of 4 reserves that are each managed in slightly different ways for multiple uses. It's mostly forest, northern temperate, hardwoods, and mixed hardwoods and conifers in various stages of secondary succession. So this is like most forests in the United States and most forests in the Northeast in a state of ongoing steady regrowth. More than half of Ithaca College's land is undeveloped and protected. Some of it, with some actual legal standing in 2 conservation easements. We have almost 100 acres that are protected in perpetuity through that legal private land conservation mechanism. Ithaca College is right there. Hopefully you can see my cursor. And the built campus is right there on what I like to call the nose of South Hill. And we're located within Tompkins County, central upstate New York. And we have 432 acres in these 2 reserves here, South Hill Natural Areas East and West. And we have 127 acres that are in the town of Newfield. That's about 10 miles, 20 minutes drive away. So while the lands in adjacent to Ithaca College are literally in our own backyard, we do a little bit less frequent activity in some of those other holdings. But the study I'm talking about takes place on all 4 of those parcels. We are zooming out a little bit. We're within the Finger Lakes region. It's part of New York State's Emerald Necklace Priority Land Conservation Initiative. And this is a only modestly doctored satellite image that shows what I like to think of as the green smile that stretches throughout the southern Finger Lakes region, kind of wrapping around Ithaca and Ithaca College here south of Cuba Lake. Zooming back in, we have South Hill Natural Area in the context of the built campus, and this is rather small on my screen, so I apologize for probably being kind of small on your screen as well. But what I'm circling here with my cursor is the built part of Ithaca College's campus, and the white boundaries are showing South Hill Natural Area East at 365 acres, South Hill Natural Area West at 67, located across State Road 96B. As I said, this is literally in our own backyard, and Ithaca College's land is used. The natural lands are used for a lot of different um, functions. They serve a lot of purposes for the various members of the campus community. We have 7 miles of trail, much of which is readily accessible. And I suppose before I get too far, I should also acknowledge that the land belongs to the Guayacoto people since 13,000 years ago and still today. And it's unceded, taken through violence. It's a history that many of us know. So while I don't perform this land acknowledgement like many do at the beginning of the talk, I do think that it's practically and principally worth mentioning. In a personal way, I feel really uneasy calling myself the manager of land that Ithaca College owns when it's really more like occupation. But in any case, any claim that I make to management here is at best a modest attempt at stewardship. So why do we do this? Well, you may have heard climate change is happening, and land use, depending on who you ask research-wise, accounts for somewhere between 15 and 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for that climate change. And what the natural lands does for Ithaca College is mitigation of the climate problem via forest regrowth. It's a process known fairly widely, and I think fairly widely understood these days, as carbon sequestration. It's a process by which photosynthesis takes up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and plants, particularly trees, long-lived woody perennials, incorporate that carbon dioxide into their tissues or into their biomass, and they sort of lock it up or store it for the relatively long term. The natural lands also provides Ithaca College with a sort of climate adaptation function as well. And if we were to think about the region that we're in, it's very hilly. We have thin, if any, topsoil, and the forests that we keep intact in forest, those lands that we keep in forest here on South Hill, are helping to keep what little topsoil we have, abating erosion and mitigating major, storm runoff events, which I can say in my relatively short time in upstate New York, 15, 20 years, I've seen things change. In particular, in the summer, I've seen a pretty considerable increase in the intensity of summer storms. And so micro scale runoff is a problem for our region. And so keeping Ithaca College natural lands forested is, we think, an important measure to help our community adapt. It's an overall resilience initiative. And when I think about it in those terms, when I think about what the natural lands does broadly vis-a-vis our climate readiness, I include some pretty far-flung things like recreational benefits and spiritual benefits, and some of those cultural ecosystem services that we need to help ourselves deal with what's going on, just as well as the land needs to keep its topsoil in place. So Ithaca College has a robust and I would say revitalized commitment to sustainability, part of which is minimizing and bringing to net zero its greenhouse gas emissions, and the college considers that the Ithaca College Natural Lands is an important part of that. You can sort of see that here in its web representation of itself. Ithaca College is a primarily undergraduate institution, which is primarily focused on teaching. And I say so not just to clearly identify what it is we do and what we do best, but also as a bit of a disclaimer, in the sense that research projects, for the most part, at least the ones that I am active in, or at least somewhat, and often they're mostly about teaching students how to do research, not necessarily publishing results at the frontiers of climate science. So everything that I'm about to present to you, and for all I know, you're forest scientists, you know, is not, it's done in a more sophisticated way in other places and has been for a long time. So the lens through which we're looking at this, the lens through which I look at it, and you know, the lens through which I'm sort of pitching this presentation is sharing what role this plays for us in an educational context. In that vein, what I have found that this teaches students better than many other things is land, climate, carbon dynamics, natural history, tree identification, sampling, data collection, which could include instrumentation, field techniques, some of the executive functioning skills like organization, logistics, and safety that go along with data collection, database management, analysis and interpretation of the data when once they're put together and once they're vetted, and presentation of the results to a diverse audience. So I think that those are all things that our students get out of a project like this, regardless of preparation or knowledge is. You know, certainly some students come in with different skill sets, but you could enter this project with none. And as a case in point, I have my own children here who at this time are ages 14, 11, and 11. And they're basically doing the field data collection component. It's a very, very simple study. We'll talk about methods in a minute. We did not, as I said earlier, invent forest carbon research. There's a rich literature out there. A lot of it is more sophisticated than the work that we're doing. And I also should acknowledge that there's a long history of the teaching of the research. So a couple examples appear on screen here. We have the National Science Foundation funded Carleton College initiative that goes back at least as far as 2009. Many others since then have done similar things. Cornell University, of course, and I say of course because they are our bigger cousin across the gorge here in Ithaca, New York. They have a you know, robust, spatially explicit version of the kind of study that we're doing. But in particular, I want to call attention to Colgate University, which has been inventorying its forest carbon since 2018, using methods that are identical to the methods that we use here. So I worked a couple times at Colgate, and I'm friends with the folks there, both the scientists and their sustainability coordinator. And with gratitude and proper attribution, I have borrowed, or maybe you could say replicated their procedures here at Ithaca College. And it's been helpful for us in this study to have that kind of anchor, to have you know, that study going on not far away in a similar forest using the identical procedures. So Colgate gets special attention as our methods role model. They in turn followed U.S. Forest Service protocols. For anybody who's interested in this stuff, it's GTR NRS 18. I could put that in the chat maybe later. Measurement guidelines for the sequestration of forest carbon. We have several different forest types here in Ithaca College Natural Lands, and we needed to make sure that they're all represented. So we used a stratified random sampling procedure, and we put our parcels into a GIS, and we said, give us a spatially random distribution of plots and make sure that you don't leave any of our forest types out. And so the result is what you can sort of barely see on the southwest region of the slide. And that is 26 of our 41 plots that are placed throughout South Hill Natural Area East. The banner up top is a 360-degree view of what a plot looks like. It's a 10th acre circle, which means a radius of about 33 feet 7 inches. And there's a stake in the center. You can kind of see that. You can see the head of the stake. This is a view outward toward the edge of the plot. And What you see here in the center is a 10 basal area factor prism, which is probably familiar to anyone who's done forestry work. And the cool trick here is that by painting the top of your stake exactly 13 inches, 13-inch white band, and standing at exactly 33 feet 7 inches away, you can use the prism in the same way that you would use it to count in trees and out trees if you were doing plotless timber cruising or sampling for forest science. So we're kind of applying the prism in the reverse way, the inverse way that it's typically used, but it works great because what that means is we're not running tapes through a tangled mess of trees all summer long. If a tree is alive and bigger than 3 inches at breast height, which is 54 inches off the ground on the uphill side, then it's included. And so the example you see on the left is a tree that's not quite big enough. It will eventually be matriculated into the study once it grows a little bit. If the tree is big enough, it gets tagged. And every summer we go back and we measure all of our trees. And we measure that tree until it dies. So the tag is both a marker for where to take the measurement. It's a modest standardization measure that keeps us putting that tape in the same place every year. And that actually really matters because the increments that we're seeing on these trees are usually within 1 or 2/10 of an inch per year. So, you know, if we were a little bit too high, the tree is going to measure too small. If we're a little too low, the tree is going to measure too big. I even have field notes in my notebooks, which you can see there on the right, that say things like avoid not, or, you know, go under bark, you know, plate, or something like that. Helps us make sure that we're getting good data in the field. And I am actually really confident in the data that we're getting in the field. In part, that's because I've been doing most of the measurement myself for these first couple of years. But I think we're at a point right now where the notes are robust enough and the protocols are robust enough that we can get any student out there on their own. Students work with me now, but they should soon be able to go out on their own and do this. Field notes are logged in a shared spreadsheet, which you can see in the southeast corner of the slide, and then they go to the computer science department where I have a collaboration with one of my faculty members there. Okay, so how do we, and I say this part not knowing what the background is of y'all. Forgive me if you're carbon sequestration researchers, but you know, just to make sure we're all on the same page, how we get from diameter at breast height, which is the measurement, to total forest carbon is basically what you see here. It's based on Forest Service research from 2003, Jenkins et al. Paper, whose reference I'd be happy to provide upon request, but you can actually see it there. It's from Forest Science. Trees build biomass differently. So, for example, willows, you know, are kind of soft and spongy, quick to grow, but you know, very light in weight. There isn't really much to them. Oaks, on the other hand, are very slow growers, and the wood's very dense, heavy, and hard. And those, you know, two logs of those two species are not going to contain the same amount of stored carbon. As you can see in the graph, all trees gain biomass more or less exponentially. But and these are what are we seeing? 10 different species groups, and the species tend to sort themselves into groups. So there is not a unique curve, at least statistically speaking, not a unique curve for every species out there. You can reliably clump them together. So if you were to look at number 1 up there, it is the maple, oak, hickory, beech group. Now I should point out though that this includes only some maples. So some of the genera are actually split. So we have, for example, hard maple, or what foresters call hard maple or sugar maple, which is in a different group, has a different curve from soft maple or red maple. So you'll see that a little bit later on in the results. Just a point of clarification, we do not pretend to know how old these trees are. We'd have to core them in order to do that. We don't have a need to know how old these trees are. What these graphs show is relationships between biomass and trunk diameter, not between biomass and age. So the differences are more about density than they are about the growth rate of the tree. Yeah, research shows trees are significantly clustered in groups. I think I already mentioned that. So all we really have to do then is get the species classified within its group. And this is one of those inroads for a less experienced student. They don't need to know the difference between a scarlet oak and a red oak. They just need to know that this is in the red oak group. And that's enough. I mean, the trees are all identified in the first place, but if they had to enroll a new tree into the study, they don't need to key that thing out to species in most cases. Once we get that species classified within its group, we can assign an allometric equation with unique coefficients that will estimate the biomass from the DBH. Okay, so we go from, again, to review, we go from diameter to biomass, and then we can estimate the carbon fraction within that biomass. Okay, and then we can do the fun stuff like consider carbon dioxide equivalents.
So Greg
looking,
has a question. Do you mind if he
not
asks
at
his
all. I'm
question now?
happy. Sorry, I should have opened this up to questions.
No problem.
Earlier. Go
No
ahead.
problem.
Jake, just a real quick confirmation on the last slide. So biomass is looking at the dry carbon weight and not the embedded moisture. You're removing that in your estimate. I was just trying to understand, since moisture is such a large fraction of weight, if you're taking that out, and that's my impression, but I just wasn't clear looking at your information.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I don't think that's actually clear from that information, but that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Anytime really, anytime we talk about tree carbon in a climate sense, the biomass term that we're using is not including all that moisture. Trees are much heavier than their carbon numbers would suggest. So we start just taking it from the top on this table. We have 227 hectares in total. So now I'm going to switch from forestry speak, which is standard units, acres and inches, to scientist language, which is metric. So our 560 acres are 227 hectares. You can see there how it's divided up among the 4 reserves that we saw on the map earlier. And I have, unfortunately, I got to bear with me while I make one edit here. I need to get that out of there. Okay. And I had something. Okay, can we still see? Are we good? Okay, excellent. You may have noticed I had to get rid of a pasted screenshot on top of my results table here. Here what you can see is just basic descriptive statistics, if you could even call it that, descriptive statistics of the results. But the bottom line there is 148,338 metric tons, not of carbon, but of carbon dioxide equivalent. So in order to get to that number, there's a bunch of calculation that we have to do. I mean, it's not a bunch, really. It's a fairly simple calculation. 3.67 is the magic number that takes you from tree carbon to carbon dioxide equivalents. So anyway, 148,000 metric tons of that CO2 equivalent in the forests of Ithaca College Natural Lands. That's about 654 metric tons per hectare. And this is, and that's kind of the punchline. We can break this up and ask some questions about those results, but it's what we can do right now, having just done 1 complete year of data collection. Project's been going on for some time, but we've been working out kinks, fixing and revising and updating protocols, and kind of just making sure that the data sets that we get are ironclad. And now we're confident in that, but we've only got 1 year. The increments being what they seem to be, an annual return interval is probably more frequent than we need. Colgate, for example, is coming back every 5 years, and I think that's probably a good interval for us to return as well. Even so, we're in the ballpark of what Colgate was getting. For example, Colgate recently reported 210,000 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent for their 1,000 acres. And so we've got a little more than half of that, and we're coming in with a little bit more than considerably actually more. But you know, we're more or less in the ballpark. So the following run of graphs are just kind of breaking apart and just kind of breaking apart the data to ask questions about things like per reserve, per forest type, and per species. So we'll start with per reserve. This is kind of a policy question. What if we were to sell one of our reserves, or what if we paved it for parking? What would that mean for forest carbon? And what you can see here is that among those 4 reserves, our biggest reserve, the one with 365 out of 560 acres, holds the most carbon. There's no surprise there. What we're really seeing is a function of the size of the reserve. The relatively smaller reserve with comparable forest types actually shows the greatest carbon level per hectare, and that's what you can see in the bar graph. Okay, so those two are not the same once you control for total acreage. Total carbon per forest type, it's kind of an ecological or a forestry question. Which successional northern hardwoods, for example, successional old field, bottomlands hardwoods in our riparian areas, what are the forest types that seem to be currently holding the greatest amount of carbon? And again, the forest type with the greatest proportional representation also holds the greatest proportion of total carbon, and that's our successional northern hardwoods, which it's most of the forest holdings that we have, and so it is I guess I would say unsurprisingly has the greatest proportion of the total carbon. And this time our most abundant forest type is also our most carbon rich hectare for hectare. So I guess that's a good thing. You know, if we've got mostly successional northern hardwoods, we're happy to know that in fact is as carbon rich as it gets per unit area as well. Carbon sequestration per species is kind of a natural history biological question. Font is kind of small here, so I'll apologize for that, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'll also try to linger on this slide so you have a chance to read those species and species groups. I could point out a couple things. One is that we found no significant differences among the various white oaks, for example, so we left them as a white oak group. Same is true for the hickories. The entire Carya genus was coming out basically the same, and for sake of clarity and simplicity and presentation to the public, which is what you're seeing here. You're seeing our front-facing, kiosk poster. Those species are lumped together. So it is quasi per species that I'm talking about right now. The very long bar at the bottom is red maple. For any folks who are in central New York, among the successional forests of our region, you will not be surprised to see that red maple accounts for, in our case, upwards of 60% of our individual trees. And so it also accounts for a large proportion of our total carbon stock. Now for the fun stuff, the overall results when converted to lots of other things like barrels of crude oil. So our standing stock of forest carbon, that 148,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, if we were to mess around a little bit with some of the calculators provided by the Environmental Protection Agency, we see 81,000 tons of coal, 16.7 million gallons of gasoline. And my personal favorite, 18 billion smartphones. And I have to imagine that that's probably somewhere around the world's stock of cell phones. So we could charge them all with the carbon that is currently stored in our forests. Getting back to a little bit more serious stuff here. Like I said earlier, the first year of complete and vetted data was 2023. So we could do a 1-year increment. Once we get the 2024 data fully vetted and cleaned up, that's due to be completed in spring 2024, this coming semester. But again, what we're noticing in the field is that the growth increments are very small. These trees, for the most part, are not growing very fast, and the numbers that we're getting when we do back of the envelope estimates of what's yet to come, we're not seeing significant increases at this time. In other words, the margins of error are, probably great enough that we're not really ready to do change over time. For comparison, when Colgate does change over time, like I said, it's 5 years, and then they annualize those increments. And I think that's probably when we'll start to get our top quality annual change data, but very soon. And we are very excited for when that may come. You may have been wondering, what about all the below ground biomass? I want to flippantly say total black box to us, and that's not to say that we're disregarding that. That's probably about half of the carbon in the forest, if not more, is locked up in the soil, and yet we don't have great soil maps to work with. We don't have the capacity to do a robust sampling of the soils of the natural lands. We had for a while a colleague of mine who's a geologist who was working through that part of the study. But for right now, we're just bracketing our work to the above ground stuff, and we're not pretending to have any numbers yet on soils. We're not alone in that. It's a fairly common thing to do, but I also have to acknowledge what many climate and forest scientists know, which is there's a whole lot of carbon in the soils. One of the other things that we're not doing, and this is where we differ from, like publishable research out on the frontiers of carbon sequestration science, we're not accounting for autotrophic respiration. So, trees are also respiring. And in an indirect way, we kind of have a sense for how many trees are dying. And we could then assume that all of that biomass is heading up into the atmosphere. So we can come up with, because we have good individual, tree sampling, we could come up with some estimates on death and coarse woody debris, and another study for another day could look at those dynamics. But autotrophic respiration is one among many things that we're not taking a look at. Thinking a little bit bigger and thinking more toward the policy relevance of this within our own institution, we're interested. Our Office of Energy Management and Sustainability is very interested in the work that we're doing. We're collaborating with Scott Doyle, who is our director in that office, and when they do their emissions reporting, it's through the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute, and they're connected, they have a tool called the Sustainability Indicator Management and Analysis Platform, known as SIMAP. That outfit is connected also to Second Nature, and some assemblage of those bodies is coordinating and overseeing the reporting that we do. And we hope in the future, my crew and I hope in the future to be much more explicitly, frankly, more helpfully involved with our Office of Energy Management and Sustainability in terms of reporting. And the big question is, how much of the carbon that is sequestered on an annual basis can count as additional in offsetting terms, and so there's a few pieces to that question, most of which reside in Scott Doyle's office. But once we can get change over time analysis rather, we should be able to answer some of the questions that they have. Thinking bigger still, I see a huge opportunity for networking and collaboration among all of the institutes of higher ed that are managing land. I think it's a big, in my view, this is like one of the biggest unanswered questions in higher ed. And I have pitched this to the National Science Foundation 3 times and been outcompeted. I still believe it's a good idea, but I've been outcompeted by other better ideas. But I do hope that all of these colleges and universities in upstate New York and throughout the United States and really throughout the world that are managing these enormous land holdings, not just the land grant institutions, but like all these places, and they go by different names. They're, you know, they're patches of woods over here, and their prairies over there, and their agricultural stations, and their forest preserves. They have they're often thought of quite differently, but they are basically the same thing. What if institutes of higher ed around the world could, pull together and start in a coordinated effort, start getting serious about not just climate change accounting, but also the urgent need to take action on that. There's been a hint. The Lincoln Institute of Land Policy put out a book a few years ago, thinking about and addressing with some case studies how institutes of higher ed can serve as large landscape conservation catalysts. And I think that Ithaca College is, or at least could be, a small part of that. But like many hands make light work, as they say, and so that's one of my goals. Would be very happy to address any questions that you have. I don't even know how I did on time. Oh, not too bad. There's a little bit of time for questions. That makes me happy. And I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see those of you who may wish to ask. The older I get, the more comfortable I become with waiting. Greg, Greg, go ahead.
Okay. Jake, thanks. At this point in time, is there a way to do any historical perspectives to say our growth rate's changing with the work you're doing? Understanding, is there a way to look back 100 years ago and compare your results for the area or not?
The short answer is I don't know, but I think that would be so fascinating. I think that would be so fascinating. I have a hint, like I have this hunch that this is the kind of thing that David Foster and others are probably doing. That would be my guess. Because there certainly is historical, there's environmental history on forests, and what I haven't frankly read enough about is how about the carbon bit.
And just a quick aside, is your buckthorn species native there, or is it invasive like we have? And I've spent years dealing with on my property.
As you could probably guess, it's the latter. Yeah.
I was curious seeing it in your inventory, actually.
Yeah, we have quite a bit of European buckthorn, and our ongoing, and some might say losing, battle against invasive plants is like a story for another day. But it's a long story. Mm-hmm. Ken?
Thank you. That was a great presentation. I appreciate that. I think you're doing a wonderful job of constructing a really good framework for students to learn about forestry and carbon. My research involved forest carbon to a fair degree. One thing that comes to mind that you could add as a kind of there's a two-way interaction between forests and climate. The forests, of course, by accumulating carbon can mitigate carbon dioxide buildup, but there's also the impact of climate on forests. And there's been a lot of research that's been done on the degree to which ranges for forest ecosystems are going to be changing over time. And it seems like it'd be relatively easy to add to the curriculum some of the information about the extent to which the forest types that you have may be moving further north, and which of those are most sensitive to climate change. I think there's literature. If you go to Tree Search, it's the research website for U.S. Forest Service, and put up forest migration or tree migration or range migration, you'll come up with quite a few publications that are both actively trying to manage for migration and are also trying to predict migration. So it seems like something relatively interesting to add to a curriculum that kind of gets students thinking about what may happen to these forests over time. In addition to them, accumulating carbon, they're going to be changing because of the effects of climate change. So, but I
Absolutely.
applaud your work.
Thank
It seems
you.
like a great vehicle for getting students involved. And thank you.
Thank you for that. And I to respond, I can say that our students are interested. Like we talk about that anecdotally, and students are really interested in that concept that forests are migrating and species are winking in and out and becoming more dominant or not. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of fertile ground there for that.
Yeah, there are maps showing how the range for a particular kind of forest type are going to be bumping forward, and you could just look for the kinds of types that you have. Are you currently at the edge? You may not be at the edge of ranges, for example, in which case the influence may not be very great, but you could conceivably be at the edge for I don't know.
Yeah, we are. We happen to be at the edge of something like birches. We're sort of at the southern edge of some birches and things like that.
Yeah.
The other variable I would add to that is deer. Deer over browse is probably the #1 threat that we have in our forests right now. And so there's that on top of the climate change, the range shifting. There's this, you know, um, well, sort of competition, but with the influence of overbrowse. It's a race to thrive. That's that's underway with that. Thank you. I know I have chat questions, and I'm not very good at managing that, but I see I have 7 of them. But first, I'll call on Susan.
My questions might be a little more basic. Okay, I'm not quite maybe with where, but I'm curious. I have 2 questions. One is, do you know of some good statistics on, if I plant a tree, and if it happens to be one type of tree versus another type of tree, is there a good estimate or a place where I can get a good estimate of approximately how much greenhouse gas I may be sequestering in the future? So do you know of that resource? First of all, that's question 1.
Okay. Yes and no. I know that that resource exists, and I will refrain from speculating where it is. I want to say it might be the Environmental Protection Agency. It might be EPA that does that. And for example, there are cities that do that, and they put plaques on their trees. Chicago comes to mind, but I'm sure that's elsewhere too. And so this street tree will be not only labeled as a ginkgo or
Right.
tulip tree, but it's also got X amount of carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's a really
Okay.
good passive programming public teaching tool. You're onto something there, but I couldn't say exactly where that is.
Okay. Second, sequestration of carbon. There's really maybe 2 or 3 parts, and maybe you spoke about this, but I may not have clearly understood it. But it seems to me that, you're sequestering carbon in the wood, you're sequestering carbon in the ground, and the tree is breathing. Now, it seems to me that the first 2, sequestration in the tree and in the ground, do not, it's stored once and it may vary only slightly each year. But the third one, which is actual breathing, might actually have more of an impact, a delta on a per year basis. Am I heading in the right direction, or what's your comments on that?
Yes, definitely a good question. Like you're thinking about this in the right way. And I'm on shaky ground to get into a more precise, basically carbon cycle diagram, which is basically what you're talking about. The way I think about it, though, is that these trees, although it's sort of like your own body. We're made of carbon, and we last for however many years we last, but every second we're breathing. So there's like different cycles going on there. When I think about carbon sequestration, I'm thinking about long-term storage in basically woody biomass. And I believe that that's accounting for shorter cycle dynamics as well. Meanwhile, in the soils, as you rightly pointed out, there's basically the same thing going on. There's long-term and short-term stuff, and I'm gonna stop there because I'm sure there are people on this call who can explain this better than I can. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right about those things. It doesn't change the way that I would talk about the results, I think. But
Okay.
it's important that that we get all that stuff straight.
Yeah, your results tend to be long-term. They're not short-term.
Yeah, and if I had to guess, I'm going to say that the shorter term dynamics are incorporated into that. In other words, it's a net.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
But I bet I'm going to bet Ken's got some clarification here. Go ahead, Ken.
I put a link in the chat to a publication which will give you some idea of the level of carbon in a particular forest type in a particular locality in the United States. It'll give you a kind of a ballpark, and it also gives kind of increase rates, annual increase rates. Now, in any particular circumstance, your locality could differ, but it's intended to give a ballpark idea. And there are tools available. Forest Service has tools. If you just type into Google, Forest Service tool for carbon, forest carbon estimation, they're tools, some of which are pretty user friendly. So I'll continue looking, see if I can happen to find one.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Ken. And I am now in the chat, and I can see that it's mostly really useful resources. Thank you, everybody, for that. I'm going to ask Nancy if I can get a copy of this, and I've been taking notes, believe it or not, as we go on some of the great things that you've had to share. This looks like a question. John asks, which online plant identification tool do students like best? Is this the tool you use? I got a couple of dusty old books and my colleagues who've taught me how to identify plants. I'm sure there's a really flashy and scientifically sound tool online, but I don't know what it is. I've just sort of learned the old-fashioned way, I guess. And here's Scientific Americans may lead. Okay, cool. Yeah, fires. One of these days I'm going to teach a course on fire, and it's going to need a part 2. Should bamboo, John again, should bamboo be a prioritized species when appropriate, when carbon content will be kept from re-entering the atmosphere? Frankly, that question's out of my league. It's an interesting one, but I don't think I can answer it. Are tree harvesting methods being developed that will be commercially viable, in scare quotes, for selective cutting, clearing the way for diverse species, removal of diseased trees, optimal carbon sequestration? If that's a question for me as land manager at Ithaca College, I can say that we have in the past done selection cuts for forest health, to minimize disease outbreak potential and that sort of thing. We don't honestly have much capacity to actively manage our forest in that way. Notwithstanding that we're not the ones doing the logging, we don't have. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. We don't have the capacity. That like everything that I do for the natural lands is like 12.5% of my workload, and I'm the only one for the most part. So like whatever I can rally my students to do gets done, and then some of that higher order stuff like managing invasive plants, logging for forest health, and that sort of thing is just stuff that we can't pull off. Here's a question from Dennis. Do you know colleagues, colleges, or universities doing carbon sequestration research and accounting in the Southern Appalachian Mountains? No, but I have to imagine that they are doing it. I think this is much more widespread than I even realized working in my little snow globe. And I could open that up to the group. In fact, why don't I? Does anybody know of colleges and universities in the Southern Appalachians doing this sort of thing, or in your own neck of the woods, wherever that may be?
How close is Clemson to where that would be? Because I think Clemson has a forestry department. Any forestry department in the US is going to have people who are monitoring or capable of monitoring and talking about forest carbon. So you could put in, put that locality and just say forestry schools in X state and you see what might come up.
Yeah, and I would be surprised if the Forest Service doesn't manage a database of it at least filtering by land grant institutions that are doing that sort of thing. But yeah, Clemson seems about right. I mean, the geographer in me can say, yeah, they're definitely Southern Appalachians, far western South Carolina. And Alex is my last my last chat question for now anyway. You mentioned at the beginning that you've noticed storms getting stronger, which can remove topsoil via increased runoff. What are some of the things that you can do or have done as land manager to try and mitigate runoff and erosion? Well, much of what I do is not actually forest management as much as recreation management. And so I can speak to work that we do on the trails. There are some well-established, time-honored, and very simple methods of halting erosion from trails. And, trail management as recreation management serves two purposes in the sense that you can put water bars in on your trail and it slows the erosion off the tread surface. But just by having a trail and encouraging people to use it with the proper definers and signage and that sort of thing is concentrating your impact in the place where you want it. Apart from that, it's okay. So that's the work that I do with trails, which isn't really answering your question. I think that if I understand the question, it was getting at the forest at large. And the biggest challenge we face, I would say, as far as that is concerned, is the deer over browse. A close second would be earthworms, which are chewing up the litter layer at like lightning speed. And so the combination of deer eating all the seedlings and earthworms grinding up and defecating out all of the litter means that we have, for the first time that I've ever seen, we have galleries of completely bare mineral soil that can't be good. So just getting it's sort of like cover cropping in agriculture, just getting something to push roots into the soil and start, or at least slow down, the slow down soil loss and start soil formation. That's the top priority, and we do as much of that as we can, and it's admittedly not very much.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for the answer. I just did a dissertation on like regenerative agriculture and cover cropping. So I was curious to see if there were like parallels between that and then what happens in the forest.
Did you see anything I assume you've done an exhaustive literature review. Have you seen anything that talks about cover cropping in forests? It sort of seems like a good idea.
Yes, actually, there's the practice of agroforestry, and that is pretty much just every other row of crops, you also plant a row of trees. And that definitely, I mean, I'm sure it would work the reverse, right? Like if putting trees in the farm would help, I'm sure doing the reverse and putting more crops in the forest would have a similar effect.
Makes a lot of sense. And it also helps us get out of this like nature versus society dualism that we seem still to be stuck in. Yeah.
A quick follow-up question. Do you anticipate the overbrowsing to get worse as like winters get warmer or shorter and deer don't really need to hibernate as much or stay inactive as long during the year?
I don't know, because I don't know. That's the short answer. A longer, more speculative answer is that maybe to a point, but I kind of feel like the deer are almost at their own population limit. I mean, I think there's so many of them out there that they're starving to death. So, there might be a sort of natural check on things. The trouble is that that's very bad for the forest. I mean, like the status quo, even if the deer population stabilized where it is right now, it's a catastrophe for forest ecosystems. But Cornell Cooperative Extension, Cornell is the regional and maybe even national leader on this whole thing, and there is a bottomless well of great work and information on deer browse and forest dynamics.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jake.
Nancy.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that you said the earthworms lead to mineral soil, is because, what comes out is still a lot of organic carbon. And they've often been implicated in soil formation, you know, getting, very rich humus layers.
Okay, so here's a point where I should admit that I'm really curious about this and I don't understand it right. I too grew up thinking earthworms are good for soil. And in the last 5 years, I have been taught, I would say, but not in a formal way, that earthworms are bad for forest soil. And I surmise that this is because they're doing what I observed them to be doing, which is chewing up all the leaf litter. Do you see what I mean? So I kind of agree. I want to agree with you, and yet I'm hearing that this is a bad thing for the forest. And my mineral soil observation, I think, is because what I'm seeing, and this is in the Boothroyd Woods, which you know well, I'm seeing no more leaves. Well, first of all, I have no saplings, right? That's the deer. Then we have no more leaves. That's the worms. And yes, lots of worm poop, but it seems to be running off. And I'm looking at like gray, stinky, anaerobic clay. Now, that might be the glacier's fault where we live, right? I mean, there's just maybe very little topsoil there to begin with. But
and also, the leaves would reduce the runoff. And if you chew all the leaves, then yes, that organic matter can run off. Also, I don't know about distributions, but there are non-native species of earthworms that seem to be bad for ecosystems, and I'm not up on that. But
I
so
think
there
that's
may
what
be
we're talking. I think that's what we're talking about.
We may be.
This is what I hear anyway.
Yeah.
Greg, do you have insights on the worm question?
Yeah, I'll just jump in, and not an expert, but living in Minnesota, we've listened to several researchers from the U talk about this topic. So from my, having a garden and compost, earthworms are great. But it was a surprise to me, and I think the fact is that no earthworms are native to North America. So separate from the earthworms you have, there's also the Asian earthworms, which are the jumping earthworms introduced in the Twin Cities, which are even more destructive. But there's research here in Minnesota. You still have some lakes where earthworms haven't existed. And then there's lakes up north where the researchers are looking at the progress of the earthworms, usually left over from fishing activities, and you can see the destruction of the underlayer of the forest. It's just missing. So what was described to me is exactly what Jake was saying, is that there should be, in a climate like ours, 6 to 8 inches of mulch on top of the soils. That's what used to exist prior to the earthworms existing. And where the concentrations are heavy, there's literally nothing there. And so researchers are studying that here in Minnesota, because the earthworms are very common, especially in the urban areas. But it was interesting to hear there's some lakes where earthworms haven't been planted in, and others where they are, and they can literally see the line of distinction.
Interesting.
It seems prudent for me to pass this back to you, Nancy, knowing that some of your guests are expecting this to end at 1.
Right. I was just going to say we are at the top of the hour. So if anyone wants to stay, I imagine Jake would be willing to stay on for a little longer. But otherwise, in fact, I'm going to turn the recording off. So thank you all for coming. This was a great discussion and a great back and forth. So thank you to those who came and thank you to Jake.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Jake.
having me.